Pedimos su atención, por favor. Agradecemos su presencia y les recordamos lo siguiente. Por atención a los ponentes, una vez que haya iniciado la conferencia, se les pide de la manera más atenta que no se levanten y no salgan del auditorio. Una vez que haya terminado la conferencia, se les pide a los estudiantes que salgan por las puertas laterales para dejar disponible la salida principal para los ponentes y los invitados especiales. En caso de que los estudiantes o algunos de los ponentes o invitados no hayan registrado su asistencia, se les pide que una vez terminada la conferencia, vayan a mesa de registro para valer su asistencia. Gracias por su atención.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. Estamos en el segundo día del Segundo Encuentro de Estudios sobre Paradiplomacia e Internacionalización Territorial, con excelentes resultados, y bueno, esta sala es un ejemplo de ello. Muchas gracias por su asistencia y su activa participación. Yo soy Marcela López Vallejo, profesora del Departamento de Estudios del Pacífico y también del Departamento de Estudios Internacionales y de algunas otras instancias de aquí de la universidad. Me voy a permitir presentar a nuestro conferencista magistral, que además de ser un excelente académico en Estados Unidos, en Europa del Este, también está interesado en temas pues latinoamericanos, y por eso el día de hoy se integra a nuestra red como participante y ponente aquí en este foro. Su conferencia se titula, y va a ser en inglés la conferencia, y las preguntas pueden ser en español o en inglés, no hay ningún problema. La conferencia tiene el título de Wartime Paradiplomacy, Paradiplomacia en tiempos de guerra, Conceptualizing the Roles of Sub-State Governments During the Russian Invasion of Ukraine, conceptualizando el papel de los gobiernos subestatales durante la invasión rusa a Ucrania. Esta conferencia pinta para dar muchas preguntas, muchos debates y discusiones, especialmente porque es poco el análisis que se hace a nivel subestatal. Me voy a permitir, dear Christian, welcome to the forum. As you can see, you have a full house. You have a large crowd of students who are very happy to welcome you at Universidad de Guadalajara. So next time, please, we need you to be here.
Thank you.
Okay,
thank you.
So
thank you for
I'm going to read your biography. I'm going to do it in Spanish. El doctor Cristian Cantir es profesor asociado en el Departamento de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Oakland en Rochester, Michigan. Ha publicado en revistas como Cooperación y Conflicto, la Revista de Estudios Internacionales de La Haya y algunas otras a nivel internacional. El trabajo más reciente del doctor Cristian se ha centrado en las conexiones entre paradiplomacia y nacionalismo, los estados de parentesco y los estados en conflicto, paradiplomacia en conflicto. Este es un tema muy importante que, como les menciono, tiene un gran potencial porque hay muy poco análisis al respecto. Su enfoque regional es típicamente Europa Central y Europa del Este. Asimismo, ha sido representante de los talleres de paradiplomacia y cooperación descentralizada de la International Studies Association, que esperamos se reactiven pronto. Con esta muy breve semblanza, porque bueno, el tiempo apremia y además el currículum del doctor Cantir es bastante extenso, le voy a dar la palabra al doctor Cristian. Él nos va a dar una plática de 25 minutos más o menos para dar tiempo a, espero, sin número de preguntas y respuestas. Dear Christian, we're very welcome, and you have like 25, 30 minutes, and then we can open the floor to the bunch of questions that we will be expecting. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your very kind invitation. I'm very happy to attend a conference on paradiplomacy, which I'm sure you all agree doesn't get enough academic or policymaker attention as it should. So I'm very glad to see this popularized. I especially want to thank Dr. Lopez Vallejo for the invitation and for her stellar work in paradiplomacy. You're all very lucky to have her there. I'm very happy to see that she continues to be very active in the field of paradiplomacy. I'm sorry to give this talk in English. English is actually my third language. My native is Romanian. It's close to Spanish, but not close enough for me to be able to give a talk in Spanish. So I'll be speaking in English if that's okay. How should we do the PowerPoint presentation? Should I just okay, perfect. So let's go on to the next slide. So this one is part of an ongoing project on paradiplomacy. It's rooted in the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So I continue to conduct research, collect data. So it's kind of an ongoing, fascinating summary or kind of data collection process. I'm just really interested, as all of you are, in paradiplomacy in general, especially in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So just as a basic setup, basic kind of introduction, most of you are familiar with this, so I won't be talking about the kind of the setting too much or the setup. But Russia invades Ukraine in February 2022. You see in the map to your right just a very basic indicator of where some of the Russian attacks took place. So you can see that the Russian army went primarily after Kyiv, the capital, but then there are also attacks in the south and in the east. The attacks on Kyiv, of course, failed, so now most of the military attacks are in the south and the east, so the war is ongoing. The map that you see to your left is a UN letter in February, on February 25th, so right after the war began, condemning or criticizing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That map has become bluer, especially in light of the UN General Assembly criticizing the annexation of the 4 territories in Ukraine. Now, this general setting, I think, poses a lot of questions for international relations. And of course, some of the first reactions that we saw were by sovereign states, primarily reactions to violations of international law, the invasion itself, but also behavior during the invasion, and of course, revelations of war crimes in Bucha, Irpin, and a number of other locations. So the first reaction, of course, was by sovereign states, international organizations, and so on. But like any good paradiplomacy scholar, one of the questions that I always ask whenever I look at international relations is what local governments are doing in this regard. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So the logical question here, of course, is going to be, well, why should we care, right? Why should we be interested in what sub-state diplomacy has to say with respect to the war in Ukraine? Well, one of the things that happens with the war in Ukraine is that it puts local governments in a situation in which they have to react. Now, why do they have to react? Well, there are certain structural conditions that make these governments basically part of the international system, and therefore have to elicit some sort of reaction. There are a couple of conditions here, structural conditions that I've noted. The map to your right is a map of American cities that have sister city ties with Russian partners. So that's one of those structural conditions, right? American sister cities across the world, of course, have partners in Russia. You can see that there are quite a few of them in states like California, Texas, and so on. So that's one of the kind of the situations in which the Russian invasion of Ukraine arises. Another element here is the not the dependence, but the participation of local governments in transnational business networks, transnational capital, and so on. In other words, local governments, as most of you know, interact with the rest of the world, invest, have state pensions invested in a bunch of other countries or in transnational corporations or whatever. So these kind of patterns of interdependence elicit the need for a reaction by sub-state government. So that's why this question, I think, is very important to ask. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So here, I'm going to talk about the initial reaction by sub-state governments, and that reaction has been ostracism and punishment of Russia in particular. And there are a couple of elements that I'm going to mention here, but the very first one, if you were following what was happening in the United States and in other countries in the first few weeks of the war, there was a lot of talk about divestment. Now, for scholars of paradiplomacy who are familiar with divestment in the context of the apartheid-era South Africa regime in the 1970s and 80s. So there's a long-standing tradition of sub-state governments trying to divest and cut ties with Russian entities. It's primarily state pensions, public and private investments. They are not significant in absolute terms, of course, especially compared to investments by larger entities, but they are significant to local governments. To your right, you see the map below is a map of executive actions trying to divest from Russian entities. The map above is legislative action at the state level in the United States, also seeking divestment. And there's a very compelling quote that I have on the slide here that I think catches a lot of the initial kind of actions by sub-state governments. So the reporter essentially says that there's no way to know how much investment there is by state government entities, but we're talking about billions of dollars. And one of the first reactions, of course, by state officials, by local officials, is to try to cut these ties. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And with the desire for divestment, we see rather explicit statements about why this is necessary. And in particular, there's an effort to express outrage and to punish the Russian government for its actions in Ukraine. There are a couple of compelling quotes here from a couple of officials, local officials, one of them from North Dakota. As you can see, the statement is that we're all appalled at the humanitarian disaster that's happening for this needless war. And then one particularly compelling one that has stuck with me by Washington State Governor Jay Inslee, he said that if our state can put one brick in the wall around Putin, it will be a good thing. This suggests that a lot of these local officials, local activists are engaged with international relations and believe that they need to comment on international legitimacy, on invasions, on major actions at the global level, and they see themselves as part of this kind of coherent, holistic approach to dealing with Russia. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Another reaction that starts to become rather visible, and here I'm giving examples primarily from the United States, but this is at the global level as well. We see this with a lot of Japanese cities, for instance, quite a few in the UK, and so on. Cities begin to cut ties with their sister city partners. So you see here just a few examples. There's one report that comes out very soon after the invasion that suggests that about 10% of U.S. cities are cutting ties. This is ongoing, so it's still continuing. I'm keeping track of these developments. But you can see Oklahoma City, you can see the city of Charlotte, Durham, and so on. So quite a few begin to have these long conversations, some of them painstaking conversations about cutting ties with Russian partners. And let's move on to the next slide, please. And here, the goal is also ostracism and punishment. So now, of course, compared to divestment, cutting ties are mostly symbolic actions. They're meant to show opposition to the war. They're also explicitly meant to show Russian partners or allow Russian partners that oppose the war to vocalize opposition, to have the opportunity to do so. There's an emerging topic also as I'm doing more and more research on cities that cut ties or have decided to suspend ties. There's a fear that the Russian government is using continuing sister city relationships for propaganda purposes, essentially to suggest that while central governments are opposed to Russia's invasion in Ukraine, the real people, this is a kind of a populist argument, the real people at the local level are against it. Cities are very aware of this argument and are therefore trying to use the suspension of ties as a suggestion that these claims made by Russian propaganda are untrue. The screenshot that you see at the bottom of the screen is part of a fascinating discussion in the city of Portland, Oregon. Probably one of the most complex and one of the most refined local debates about what American cities should do with respect to the war in Ukraine. I highly recommend, if you have the time, I can send you the link. There's a 70-page PDF in which they talk about all of these arguments. Absolutely fascinating. But you see that one of the reasons that activists here are pushing for cutting ties is because the Russian government is essentially claiming that the continuation of these ties is suggestive of support, as it were. Let's move on to the next slide, please. This is not to suggest, however, that everybody's cutting ties, everybody's divesting. One particularly interesting development in the United States and a few other cities around the world is a decision not to cut ties. So San Jose, for example, had a debate on this topic. There are a number of other cities that decided not to cut ties. Now, what are some of the reasons why cities would not do this in light of some of the fears that I've mentioned before? One of those arguments is that one needs to keep lines of communication open. It's the argument that democracy survives through communication, and therefore cutting ties would sever those connections. The idea is also not to abandon friends who oppose the war inside Russia, giving them an opportunity to maintain these networks with American partners. And of course, there's an argument that severing ties would be inconsistent with the principles of sister city agreements. So there's this ongoing kind of dialectical argument between the cities in the United States and other areas about cutting ties, not cutting ties, and deciding on what the best approach is. Of course, to a paradiplomacy scholar, all of this is absolutely just mind-blowing, because you have a debate by local governments that were not really thinking about Russia much before February 2022. You have this complex and complicated debate about what to do. Let's move on to the next slide, please. One of the more interesting developments as well, I'm just saying that everything is interesting here, which is pretty true of, I think, anybody who likes paradiplomacy or substate diplomacy. One of the more interesting developments as well is that Russia is engaging in some counter-ostracism or anti-ostracism efforts. One of them is by reinforcing some existing subnational networks. So to your left, you can see a screenshot from a statement by the governor of Gagauzia, a small autonomous region in the Republic of Moldova in Eastern Europe, in which she refuses to condemn Russia for the war in Ukraine, but pushes for peace and maintaining relations with Russia. In addition, Russia has been fairly effective thus far at trying to identify some new partners despite the war, right? So an example here is Cebu City in the Philippines, where the Russian ambassador visited Cebu City prior to this and thanked the city and Filipino authorities for remaining neutral during the conflict itself. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Finally, another really big development, of course, has to do with Ukraine. So I've talked about ties with Russia so far, but a lot of cities around the world are beginning to use existing networks or are creating networks to provide aid to Ukraine. Again, in absolute terms, this is not going to turn the war around, right? So Ukrainian authorities are receiving the most substantive assistance from sovereign states. At the local level, however, relatively speaking, this aid is significant for local communities. And one particularly a new development that I've noticed is the emergence not only of direct ties, right? So you see US cities working with Ukrainian cities, Romanian cities, cities in the European Union, but also we see a lot of examples of cities helping intermediary cities in Poland and Germany and Romania that are dealing with refugees and so on. And those cities subsequently help Ukrainian cities. So we have the development of these kind of triangular relationships that bring more complexity to partnerships of local governments. And you see here an example. I think this is a city from Texas that is partnering with its Polish sister cities to help Ukrainian refugees. So this aid is not only direct, but is also present in indirect ties. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And here, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about aid, I have a few examples from some of the places that I study, in particular, Detroit. I live in the Metro Detroit area. This is where the university is. So the Detroit City Council had a conversation about donating body armor to Ukraine. This is one example. Some cities, Winnipeg in Canada, for example, are pledging money and are therefore sending financial assistance to Ukrainian partners. Others are sending guns. So Miami had a gun buyback program and sent guns not to regular people, but to police partners in the partner cities. And finally, the other story that you see here is from a Romanian news source. The city of Timișoara in western Romania has been helping the city of Chernowitz in Ukraine with generators and other types of assistance. So you can see that assistance is really very diverse in this regard. Let's move on to the next slide, please. There is something else that is happening aside from these networks that exist between Russian cities and partners in other countries and Ukrainian cities and partners in other countries. This is something that I haven't seen before, but it certainly seems like it's a new development in the war in Ukraine and in paradiplomacy as well. Russian towns are starting to get twins in occupied Ukrainian cities. So it seems like you have local authorities that are working with central authorities in Russia to essentially consolidate occupation in Ukraine. This is something that I haven't really seen before in paradiplomacy. I think it's worth exploring. It's worth researching and examining. There is still even a question of why Russian authorities are doing this, right? One would imagine that this is probably to diversify the networks that exist between local governments in Russia and Ukraine, but we still don't know much about it. It's just something that I've been tracking, and it kind of indicates we normally tend to think of paradiplomacy as carrying this promise of cosmopolitanism, of furthering democracy and so on. But this kind of shows the dark side of paradiplomacy in a way, right? Because it involves an occupying country using its own local governments to consolidate occupation in another state. So something definitely worth monitoring in the future. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And finally, I'd like to kind of summarize some of the reflections here and ask a few questions for the future. Obviously, the war has not lasted for a very long time, so we haven't had a kind of a long period of time, not only to collect data, but also to kind of understand the causes and the consequences of paradiplomatic actions during the war in Ukraine. But I think we can make a few tentative conclusions as we continue to research this topic more. I think one of the biggest questions, of course, and for those of you who are going to end up doing research on paradiplomacy, for those practitioners who are going to get involved in sub-state diplomacy, this is one of the questions that we always get, right? Does local action make a difference? In my view, based on some of the research that I've done thus far, there are a number of patterns that I've seen emerge. First of all, local governments have indeed amplified material and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. This has made a difference. It's made a difference to local communities in particular. It's also amplified ostracism. Now, of course, sovereign states engage in this particular type of behavior, but local governments can amplify and consolidate some of these measures at the local level. This is very clearly bothering Russian authorities. The Russian ambassador to the United States recently said in an interview that he was very upset that U.S. cities in particular were cutting ties with Russian partners. This also maintains tensions in local communities. This is the case in the United States, but I think in a lot of other countries, local communities are not as involved in international relations as central authorities, right? This is just something that is a reality that scholars of sub-state diplomacy have to deal with. And having sister city ties, having individual organizations work with partners makes a huge difference. I'm also seeing the process of Europeanization, this argument that European entities, cities, and so on are going to help with the Europeanization and development process of Ukraine, especially as Ukraine has become a EU member candidate. Finally, for those of you interested in paradiplomacy, and there's a lot of work to do here, the question is how long this ostracism will last, what its long-term effects will be. I have a lot of data for the global north. I don't have as much data for the global south. I suspect that some of these patterns will continue or will be similar across the world in general, but I'm kind of broadening my approach to the global level as I move beyond collecting data in the United States. But for those of you curious about this particular issue, certainly a lot to research there. I'm also curious about the potential spillover of cutting ties or this process of ostracism into other authoritarian states like China. There have been some calls in cities like Bristol, if I'm not mistaken, in the UK, to cut ties with Chinese sister city partners who are because they have refused to condemn the war in Russia. So I'll be curious to see kind of the long-term consequence here. Finally, thus far, we're kind of accustomed to seeing quite a bit of conflict in paradiplomacy, at least in some areas of sub-state diplomacy. And in the context of war and conflict, international conflict, this is probably going to come out more frequently. However, local governments have mostly harmonized their efforts with central authorities. So I'm curious to see whether there will be any sources of conflict here in the future. And I'll stop it at that, and I'll be happy to take all of your questions. Thank you for listening, and thank you for attending.
Thanks so much, dear Christian. And thanks so much for being so clear and precise and on time. We have a lot of questions for you. So let us start with the questions. Vamos a comenzar con las preguntas. Por favor, vamos a recabar de a 3 preguntas. Si alzan la mano, por ahí hay micrófonos. A ver, calentemos motores. Para que vayamos abriendo la conversación, si quieren, yo propongo una pregunta para Christian. I will start with the questions, Christian. Well, I have a lot of them. Can you tell us? Yeah, I have a list of like 5 or 6.
I have a lot of questions myself. It's it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah. The first question is precisely one of your last questions regarding the relationship between local governments and federal governments. You know, this typical clash between one another, foreign policies, if we may say so. In the case that you are presenting in the United States, these local governments or cities who support Russia, have they had any impact in the federal government's foreign policy? Is there any Is there any problem with the relations between both levels of governments? Estoy preguntando sobre los problemas que hay cuando los gobiernos locales en Estados Unidos apoyan a Rusia y el gobierno federal no. Go ahead, please.
So far, I haven't seen any major conflicts between the local and the federal level, and this is primarily because there's a kind of a harmony of goals here. So most local governments have been either absent, some of them have not commented on the war in Ukraine, or they have largely been supportive of the efforts that the federal government has made. So part of that, I think, is that in the United States, at least, and I think in other countries, support for Ukraine has spanned ideologies. I'm not talking about fringes here, but generally speaking, when we look at the continuum from left to right, there's been general support for Ukraine. So the partisan differences, which are often one of the major reasons why we see conflicts at various levels, have just not been there. I will say that I did find a couple of examples of local government officials criticizing U.S. support for Ukraine, but those are usually relatively minor comments in an otherwise generally harmonious local and federal level foreign policy.
So that means that the Trump movement is losing weight, losing force?
That's a very good question. So I've myself been surprised there hasn't been more opposition at the local level to support for Ukraine, especially in light of, as you mentioned, Trump himself, but other Trump supporters expressing either open support for Russia or criticizing Ukraine. My impression is that the kind of the traditional pro-defense Republican ideological movement has been more dominant in this regard. So there have been generally statements from both conservatives and liberals in local governments in support of Ukraine. But that's certainly something to look out for. I think in the long term, we might see more opposition, and especially now when there's so much support for Ukraine, it's a little more difficult to hear some of those voices, and I think those voices will indeed emerge.
Thank you. Okay, so any questions? ¿Algunas preguntas? ¿Algunas inquietudes? Aquí hay una, por favor.
Hi, Christian. Voy a decirlo en español. Durante mucho tiempo se ha dicho que la paradiplomacia solo toca temas de low politics, pero en la práctica el mismo origen del hermanamiento fue un origen posguerra, ¿no? La cuestión del origen del hermanamiento, reconciliación, así como también otros procesos en la guerra de Centroamérica. Muchas ciudades, muchos municipios de Estados Unidos bloquearon todo en su momento, todo lo que venía de estos gobiernos en conflicto para, bueno, obviamente no tener ninguna relación. O también el tema de la desnuclearización. En muchas ciudades se prohibió, obviamente, desde tener algún tema con fábricas atómicas o que en su momento pasara uranio por esa zona. Entonces, ¿por qué se ha dicho que la paradiplomacia no entra en temas de high politics cuando desde los finales de la Segunda Guerra Mundial sí han intervenido en ese tipo de estrategias, y lo estamos viendo con lo de tu conferencia el día de hoy?
Muchas gracias. Did you get that, Christian? Do you want some?
I understood some of it, but I want to make sure, if possible, Marcel, I want to make sure that I understood everything. I got some of it, yeah.
Yes, Professor Raifredi Lara, essential part of the Masters in Internationalization of Local Governments and Paradiplomacy, and organizer of this forum. He is asking about the origins of the twinnings being in as a post-war reconciliation mechanism, anti-communism, and anti-nuclear development. So the twinnings were originally a political weapon, right? They were, and they were used in high politics. So how come that today we normally think of paradiplomacy as a tool for low politics? We don't think really about local governments being involved in a war, as you are presenting. So can you expand a little bit? How come that how did we get to the idea of paradiplomacy being a low politics approach instead of the original scope of high politics?
I think that's a great question. I think there are a lot of different reasons why this has been the case, and of course we've all as scholars of paradiplomacy have struggled to even convince people that this stuff matters, right? That the actions of local governments can make a huge difference. I can point to one major reason that I think has been looming since the post-war era, and I think that's been the dominance of realist or realist adjacent theories in international relations. A lot of scholars and practitioners, frankly, start with the premise that local government or local diplomacy is low politics. That is, there are no military material interactions between these entities, and consequently, they're therefore relegated to some of these, as it were, less important, quote unquote, issues in international relations. So I think these realist assumptions, I think, have been partly responsible for that for this state of affairs. The big mistake, of course, has been to start with abstract assumptions instead of looking at the empirical data. So one of the things that I've been very emphatic about is to actually study empirically the behavior of sub-state governments and see the impact that they have had on international relations, rather than assuming them away by making a realist or kind of realist adjacent assumption. So I think that's part of it. The Cold War probably also had an impact on that. Although, as you noted, the Cold War actually was characterized by quite a bit of political and high politics paradiplomatic action. Anti-apartheid, the nuclear non-proliferation movement, sister city ties with some localities in Nicaragua in the 1980s, for example. There have been a lot of instances where this has been the case.
Excellent. Thank you, Christian. Any other question? There's one there. There are two. We can take three there. We can take the three, and you can, Christian, you can give a final comprehensive comment. So can
Sure.
you raise your hands, please, for the microphone? Go ahead.
Well, hello, my name is Tariq, and my question is about the role of China during the conflict and how it can make an impact on the diplomacy level. Well, since the beginning of the conflict, we've seen that, well, the role of China has been pretty awkward. It's still an ally of Russia, but it's kind of upset with the whole invasion thing. So my question is, and we saw it in the recent economical forum for the Asian nations that was like a month ago, where like China is still pushing for a peaceful solution. Can China use the influence or the mechanism of the ciudades hermanas, closed cities, to put pressure on the foreign policy of Putin's government? Basing on the last questions for the future, like the source of the conflict between the local and national foreign policy, can these mechanisms put enough pressure on the local level in Russia for them to apply pressure on the national foreign policy? Oh, thanks.
Thank you, Tariq. There's another question here. There's a ahí está el micrófono.
Hi, my name is Regina. So you talk about current relationship with Russia. So you talk about current relationship with Russia, but you also talk about no current relationship with Russia. So what do you consider is the better option that local governments and federal governments can do to reach peace, to end the war between Russia and Ukraine?
Thank you, Regina. There's another question over there.
Hi, my name is Charlie, and well, the question is, based on the role that sister cities have taken in this conflict on Ukraine, can we talk about the possibility maybe of seeing them helping in the process of recovery, or is it a bit too early to ask this question?
Excellent questions. Thank you. So, Christian, a final comment on all of those.
These are all wonderful questions. I'll speak to the first one. I haven't seen a lot of desire on the part of Chinese sister cities to participate in this kind of ostracism process. I do think that they would be able to put pressure on Russian central authorities, primarily by indicating that the isolation of Russia is now expanding into countries that Russia considers to be major allies. So I think that sort of thing would indeed help. What I suspect would happen, however, is that central Chinese authorities would not allow that sort of action to become a sort of cascade. So if there were attempts by one or two entities to cut ties or criticize the war, I suspect that in light of China's somewhat tenuous alliance, right, with Russia in the war in Ukraine, I think they would stop that for fear of it becoming controversial. I also think Chinese authorities as well are very touchy about the political involvement of Chinese subnational governments in issues that are not permitted, right? They, of course, have a lot of ties with countries around the world, but the content of those ties is controlled pretty tightly. So I think it would make a huge difference, but I think it's somewhat unlikely to happen. To the question of what local governments should do, that's a great question. I really don't know. I've been thinking about this myself. What would I do if I were mayor or if I were a member of the city council? It's a very complicated question. I think that in light of the different types of strategies that we see, the diversity of approaches might be the best way to go. Not only because it would indicate that there is a vibrant democracy within countries in which local governments can choose what to do and what to say, but it would also allow us in a way to create this sort of laboratory in which we can test what approach works best with respect to convincing Russian authorities to end the invasion. Finally, the question about recovery, I've been tracking that as well. That's a great question as well. European Union cities are now beginning to get involved in recovery processes. I suspect this will be a major development in the next decade or so, where wealthier cities from the European Union will work with partners in Ukraine to rebuild and to assist in reconstruction. We see, as I mentioned, kind of a dark side to this. The way Russian authorities are framing reconstruction in Ukraine is by using Russian cities partnering with Ukrainian occupied territories. So we see two dimensions here. I think the European Union cities assisting with reconstruction will be the more dominant ones, and I suspect will be the kind of an important element in Ukraine's revival after the invasion ends.
Excellent. Thank you very much, my dear Christian. This has been a wonderful chat, a wonderful morning here to know a little bit about how local governments interact in security affairs, especially geopolitical, in geopolitical matters. So we have to close. The program, you know, is, as you see, is kind of heavy, dense, and large. So thank you
Thank you
very
so
much.
much for the opportunity. This was wonderful, great questions, and I hope to see all of you in person next year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gracias por su atención. Les recordamos a los alumnos que la
Gracias.
salida,
Seguimos con el programa. Thank you.
les recordamos a los alumnos que la salida, bueno,